It's time to increase your bankroll by decreasing your daily fantasy sports learning curve. The Curve with Benny Ricciardi and Josh Kalashi starts now.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Curve here at rotocurve.com, where our mission is to help you accelerate your DFS learning curve and get you over that hump to profitability. My name is Benny Ricciardi. I go by BRich11 on all the daily fantasy sites, and I'm going to walk you through the first part of our show today. So let's get this party started. As always, we're going to start with a recap of our last show, go over some of the stuff that happened yesterday. We're going to move on to the weather for today, as well as the Vegas lines to give everybody an idea of some of the things that we're looking at. After that, we'll move on, talk about some of the pitchers for today, and then we'll go on to the hitters for today. Then we have a couple user questions that popped out to us. One in particular by a user named Doug Boyle that we wanted to make sure we gave him a good answer to, something that would take a little longer than 140 characters on Twitter. After that, Josh is going to come in here. He's going to do a little segment on some of his favorite plays for today. He's going to hit you with a couple of guys that he thinks you should be putting in your lineups, and also a couple guys that you think you should avoid. And then, as always, Josh and I will give you the cornerstones that we're using to build our lineups and tell you a little bit about how we're looking into tonight. So let's get started and take a look back at yesterday first. Couple things popped out at me yesterday. One of the big things was the injury to Hanley Ramirez. For you guys who saw, he went to go make a play and ran into the wall, did something to his shoulder. They haven't yet put him on the disabled list today, but it looks like he's going to be heading that way. So that's going to be a big blow to the middle of that Red Sox order. But more importantly for fantasy, for us, that takes away a guy that we've all been using at shortstop lately, paying up for him. He was one of the last guys that were remaining that had that multi-position eligibility, including shortstop. Earlier in the year, we lost D. Gordon as an option there. And a couple days ago, we just lost Billy Hamilton as an option there. So we're basically down to using actual shortstops at the shortstop position on DraftKings, which I know might sound a little weird to some of you guys, but there was a big advantage to being able to put a cleanup hitter like Hanley Ramirez with his kind of power and his kind of upside in the middle of your lineup. So for at least the next couple of weeks, it looks like we're not going to have that option on DraftKings, which is going to hurt some of the scores. Yesterday was a day of pitching. The big question everybody was asking at the beginning of the day was, do I go Felix Hernandez or do I go Clayton Kershaw? But in actuality, it looks like Dallas Keuchel was the guy who stole the show. He finished. Felix still had the highest score on the day. He finished with 29.5 if you were playing over on DraftKings. But you had to pay up about $12,500 for his services. And the same goes for Kershaw as well. Kershaw had a tough luck, lost the win at the end of the game. He didn't wind up losing the game, but he lost his chance to get a win at the end of the game. So that kept his score down a little bit. He only finished with 23.5. Keuchel was about $4,000 cheaper, or about 66% of the cost of those top guys, and he pitched great. He had a lot of strikeouts. Through 3 innings, he wound up with 7 strikeouts at the beginning, and he finished with 27 points on the day on DraftKings. So Keuchel was the guy that you really wanted in your lineups. People had been talking about him earlier. We had mentioned him as one of the guys that you should be looking at. So if you listened and you put Keuchel in your lineup, you had a really good night last night. He was definitely the guy that helped a lot of the people who scored in the top 10s in some of these GPPs. Keuchel was the guy that they had that helped them get there. Most of them had him, with either Kershaw or Felix, but Felix Hernandez and Dallas Keuchel was definitely the combination that you wanted. There were also some big bats yesterday that I wanted to mention. One of them in particular that was at min price pretty much on every site, and that was Jeff Francoeur. He went 4 for 4 yesterday, put up, I think, 27 DraftKings points. He had a double-digit number over on FanDuel as well, or close to it. I mean, for the price that you had to pay for him, he was great. Now, I don't want everybody going out there. He's min price again today. I just looked at it. I don't want everyone going out there and throwing him in your lineup. Jeff Francoeur is not a guy who has that kind of consistency, but, again, like we always say, that's baseball. On any given day, somebody can go 4 for 4 in a bad matchup, and somebody can go 0 for 4 in a good one. So, if you had Francoeur yesterday, you hit him on the right day. 4 for 4 it was big for him. He hasn't done that all season. Some things that were a little bit easier to predict, Nelson Cruz and his boomstick came to town again. So he went yard, had another home run last night, paid off his salary. So people that have been using Nelson Cruz are starting to get used to it. It doesn't matter if it's left-handed pitching, right-handed pitching. When Nelson Cruz has a chance to go yard, he's going to go yard. And it's nice when he does because it's a nice big boost to your lineup, especially because he's usually one of those guys on the West Coast that plays in the late game. So you get a nice boost up the charts when he does do something like that, which basically he has been doing often. Another guy who went yard yesterday, who's been on fire in the last couple days, is Stephen Vogt. Vogt is the catcher for the Oakland Athletics, or catcher-eligible player for the Athletics. He's dropped down in the order. He was hitting third, and Reddick was hitting fifth or sixth. But Josh Reddick has been red hot right now, so they moved Reddick up into the 3-hole, dropped Vogt down into the 5 spot, and since they dropped him down, he had 2 home runs on Sunday, had another one yesterday, so that's 3 home runs in his last 2 games. You know, whenever this guy goes up against a right-handed pitcher, you always got to take a look at him because he has tremendous power. He gets on base. He hits, you know, about 300. He's over, I think he's about 315 or 320 right now after yesterday. So Vogt is definitely one of those guys that you want to make sure you have in your lineup when you have a chance. And the last guy who was big for people yesterday was Mark Reynolds, the first base, third base eligible player for the Cardinals. He went yard yesterday, had 2 or 3 hits, wound up with 4 or 5 RBIs on the day, put up a number in the 20s on DraftKings, double-digit number on FanDuel, double-digit number on Fantasy Aces. I mean, if you were able to save money by putting Reynolds into your lineup, he was definitely one of those price-saving guys that you wanted to make sure you had. So he had a very good day yesterday, and he helped a lot of people get their lineups over the hump. So that's basically the recap of yesterday. Those are some of the things that we were able to see. Again, pitching you had to pay up for yesterday, whether you went Felix. Even if you went Felix and Kershaw were actually tough to fit in, but if you went with Felix and saved some money with a guy like Dallas Keuchel, you know, that was definitely the way to go. You spent about $20,000, or you know, if you're on DraftKings, you spend about 40% of your cap on those 2 guys. But with the return that they gave you, over 50-something points, you know, that's definitely something that puts you well on your way to doubling up in your 50-50s. Probably helped you out in a lot of your cash games if people went another way because there weren't a lot of other big pitching performances. And basically helped you cash in the GPPs. As some of the people who were in the top 10, that was the pitching matchup that they had on the day. So if you had that combination, you probably had a pretty good day. We're going to move on right now. You know, the last thing from yesterday that I wanted to mention is we also had the rain out in that Arizona and Colorado game. It seemed like there was a lot of players in the late game with pretty high ownership, so I'm thinking there were still some people who had enough of an exposure to the Arizona-Colorado game that they were able to make some late swerves on a site like DraftKings. I think a lot of people stayed away from it on a site like FanDuel. It wasn't a secret that that game might be canceled. People were talking about it basically all day long. So if you did use guys in that game hoping that you were going to get lucky, yesterday was not the day where that strategy paid off. But you could see that there was a lot more exposure to some of the guys in the late games than you would have expected. And I think that had a lot to do with, you know, people switching over. Madison Bumgarner is one of those guys that comes in off the top of my head. I'm thinking that, you know, a lot of people wound up making some changes, and in order to get the bats they wanted, they had to come down off of, you know, a Kershaw or a Felix to Matty Bum, and he pitched really well yesterday too. So it actually worked out for you if you were able to make those changes. You know, just another reason why I love the late swap feature over on DraftKings. But speaking of weather issues that we had last night, we got a couple more today that we want to look out for. Let's see, the big one looks to me, the Colorado game, it looks like there's rain today. It's not as big a chance as it was yesterday. They're saying about a 40 to 60% chance at different points in time throughout the game. The problem that I have is it doesn't seem like there's a window. A lot of times when there's rain, it might rain for an hour or two, then there might be a 2 or 3 hour delay where they're not expecting rain or expecting light rain, where they might be able to fit the game in. It pretty much looks like it's going to be raining all across throughout the game time tonight. Now, again, I'm not a meteorologist. There are people who, you know, do this for a living, and closer it gets to game time, you'll get a much better idea of it. But right now, I just want it to be something that you guys know is out there and a factor you have to consider, just in case that it does come down, because there are some bats in that Arizona-Colorado game that I know I'm going to be on today, and I expect that a lot of other people probably will be too. The only other game where there's some rain issues are the Nationals game down in Washington, D.C. Now, here's my problem with this game. I don't think that the game is going to be rained out. It looks like the rain should be clearing up by about 9 o'clock, but they may have a delay in it. What I'm hoping is they don't start the game and then have a delay and then come back to it, because as we know, the Nationals are very protective of Steven Strasburg's arm, and Strasburg's the guy who's supposed to be on the mound tonight for them. So if there is a start and stop in this game tonight, there's a good chance you don't see Strasburg come back out to pitch, depending on how long the stoppage is. Now, that's, like I said, I think they still get this game in. I don't know if it's going to be smooth, though. I don't know if the rain's going to stop and they can play it straight through. if it does look like this might be a situation where there's a start and stop, I don't really love Strasburg to begin with today, but that would definitely be a reason why I would kind of shy away from him. So it's just another thing to think about when you are making your pitching choices for the day. We do have a couple games with high wind. Cleveland and Kansas City is one of them. Oakland and Minnesota is the other, and San Diego and San Francisco is the third. Each one of these games has wind between 13 and 15 miles an hour expected. Most of it is blowing right to left, which will mean that it'll help out the right-handed hitters when they're pulling the ball over to left field. That actually may come into play in a couple of the games that we'll talk about later, especially with some of the power bats in that Cleveland game. You know, a guy like a Santana, maybe a guy like a Rayburn might give them a little more, you know, some of those shots that would go out to left center might wind up going a little bit more towards left, and they may find the wall, and they may wind up with a home run because of it. But again, I mean, wind is it's just a factor to consider. It's not something that is really going to change me from a play that I'm on or off all that much, unless we're talking about Wrigley Field and the wind's blowing straight out, because that is something that we have seen in the past be, a pretty good indicator of more runs scored. You actually notice on the Vegas lines when the wind is blowing straight out at Wrigley Field, you will notice that the Vegas lines will move from 7 or 8 before or at the open to basically the other day we had one that moves from 7 to 10.5 just because the wind was blowing out. So if you see it in Wrigley Field, it's definitely something you want to take note of. But in some of the other stadiums, it's kind of hit or miss. It's just something nice to add. If you were on some of the bats there already, it might be a nice little thing to know and be happy about before first pitch. So let's move on to those Vegas lines today and see exactly what we're talking about. There are 4 games where they were only expecting 7 runs. The first one is the Baltimore game against the New York Mets. You got Bartolo Colon on the mound in that one. It's a low-scoring game. It's basically being played in Citi Field. Citi Field, as you guys know, if you took a look at the Ballparks Factor article that we came out with, Citi Field is the field in the majors that yields the least amount of runs. So whenever we have games in Citi Field, as we always tell you with the Vegas lines, the places that yield or expected to yield the least amount of runs are usually the stadiums that yield the least amount of runs throughout the season and, over the past couple seasons. So Citi Field is definitely one of those on the list, even though Baltimore has some big bats. Like I said, they are expecting that to be only a 7-run game. Bartolo Colon is on the mound. He's been solid. Don't ask me how. He throws nothing but fastballs. He throws different types of fastballs, but he hits his spots. He doesn't throw with a lot of speed, but he changes up speeds within what he does throw. And he's been pretty successful so far. So Vegas thinks that he has a good chance to keep that Baltimore offense off balance, and that's why they only have the 7 runs on that game. The next game that has a low total is the San Diego-San Francisco game. Andrew Cashner is going for San Diego in this one against Ryan Vogelsong. As you guys know, we dubbed him Ryan Vogeldong last week, and he made us look good by giving up 4 home runs in that game to the LA Dodgers. It has been something he struggled with throughout his career, but then again, San Francisco is not the greatest hitter's park. Don't see a lot of runs over there. We don't see guys hit for high average over there, which actually even makes what Buster Posey does all that more amazing, because it's definitely not a good place for hitters, but he still winds up getting hits whenever he plays over there. So that's another game with a run line total of 7. We'll talk about Cashner a little more later when we get into the pitchers. I definitely think he's in a good spot for today. The 2 other games that have totals of 7, obviously, the Miami-Washington game with Strasburg on the mound. Strasburg is the biggest favorite, which we'll get into in a minute here, and there's only 7 runs expected there. Both of those parks, Washington and Miami, whenever there's games there, they're 2 of the parks that are, 2 of the ones where there's the least amount of runs scored. So anytime we have games played in Miami or Washington, you always got to realize that it's probably going to be a lower scoring game, and you should probably shy away from some of the bats. But with that being said, it also ticks up some of the pitchers for you. So you definitely want to make sure you keep your eye on some of the pitchers in that game as well. And the last one, as I said, is Philly and Atlanta. Basically, they're thinking that this is 2 pretty bad offenses. Chad Billingsley is going to be making an appearance for Philly today. He has not pitched in the majors in 2 leagues, but he was in 2 years. But he was a solid pitcher in this league a couple years ago. I really don't know what to expect from him. I know what kind of pitcher he was back in 2013, the last time we saw him. But I really don't know what to expect from him today. He's making his first start in over a year and a half. So you got to think that some of those Atlanta bats should be able to get to him. But again, anything could happen. The guy's been rehabbing. He could come back. We've seen guys like Bartolo Colon come back and, be pretty good. So I'm going to take a little bit of a wait-and-see approach. The fact that Vegas has a small line on this game kind of makes me think that it might be one that we should stay away from as well. And the most runs expected, obviously, the top one is going to be that Arizona-Colorado game. Anytime there's a game in Coors Field, you know it's going to have a big line. It's the stadium that yields the most runs by far in the majors. It's one of the best hitters' parks in the majors. You know, anything that goes on in Arizona, Colorado is going to have a lot of runs. And especially today when you're looking at a game where neither pitcher is really somebody who you're going to be scared of, there's, you know, some good matchups on both sides for some of the hitters, and we'll get into that in a little bit as well. The second game, the second highest run line game today is one that can, you know, I would say it surprised me a little. But that's the game between Texas and Houston. And I think the big reason why this one has such a big run line on it is because left-hander Wandy Rodriguez is going to be pitching for the Texas Rangers. Now, Rodriguez is not a very good pitcher. He bounced around the league for a little while, and he was somebody who last year we targeted against when he was pitching in Houston. So this is a revenge game for him. But to be perfectly honest with you, the way that he pitches, he's a left-hander who really gives it up to right-handed batters, gives up a lot of home runs, gives up a high average to him. I mean, he just gets hit really hard. So I think that might be the main reason why Vegas has a 9-run total on that one. They're expecting Houston to put a big number up on the board against Texas today. So that would be the reason, and it also makes you have to think that, you know, you probably want to look at some of those Houston bats. There's a couple guys there that might make some sense to include in your rosters today. The other two games with big run totals, one of them is a little surprising to me, and the other one makes perfect sense. The one that's surprising is Oakland and Minnesota. Oakland has been putting up a decent amount of runs, and Minnesota has been too lately. They've been getting hot over the past couple days. It's an 8.5 run line in that game, and Minnesota is not considered a hitter's park. So the fact that that's such a high run line makes me think that Vegas is thinking that both of those pitchers are gonna get knocked around a little bit today. So definitely makes me think I might have to take a second look at some of those Oakland and Minnesota bats. There could be a couple guys in there that we need to include in our rosters that we might have missed out on first glance. And then the other game that makes perfect sense is the Toronto and New York Yankees game. That game's in Toronto. It's a great hitter's park. The Yankees have been hot. Toronto has a power-hitting team that can explode for 3 or 4 home runs in any game. You know, the top 5 or 6 guys in that order are all home run hitters, so I can definitely see how they would expect a big line on that one. So moving on from there, we're going to start getting into the pitchers for today. We'll start by looking at some of the Vegas lines for the pitchers, and then I'll give you guys an idea of some of the pitchers that have popped out to us over here at RotoCurve while we were doing our analysis last night and this morning on, you know, who we think we should be starting today. Steven Strasburg is the biggest favorite today at -177, followed by Zach Greinke, who's at -165. The one that was kind of surprising was Scott Feldman from Houston. But again, the reason why he's such a big favorite is he's going up against Wandy Rodriguez today from Texas. So they're expecting Feldman as a -160 favorite. So they're expecting him to win. And as I said, you know, going up against Wandy, they're expecting that Houston team to put up a lot of runs. So Feldman is probably going to get hit a little bit. He very likely may give up 2 or 3 runs, but he's such a big favorite because they're expecting Wandy to give up, you know, 5 or 6 runs in that game and really get knocked around. You know, as I said, he struggles with right-handed bats, and Houston's got a lot of right-handed bats, so that's not a very good matchup for Rodriguez. 2 other guys in the middle are Jeff Locke and Shelby Miller. They're both at -150, so they're both favored today. Locke has a decent matchup in a good pitcher's park. Miller goes up against that Phillies squad. While I do like him for the win, I don't think he's a great fantasy option today. As we all know, despite the fact that the Phillies don't have a great batting average and they don't score a lot of runs, one thing they also don't do is strike out often. And if you're going to pay up for a pitcher, you really need to make sure that there's some strikeout potential with that pitcher. Otherwise, you're basically just going to be wasting your money. You're going to be burning it. So stay away from Shelby Miller today, even though he is a big favorite. I don't think he's one of those guys that I would want to be on. And then the last big favorite on the day is Garrett Richards from the Angels, and he's at a -140. He has a decent matchup, not in a bad spot. I just think he's a tad expensive on some of the sites for what he's been returning lately. So while I don't think he pitches badly today, I also don't think he has a lot of upside. You know, if you want to use him for a cash game, I can't argue against it, but I think there are some other guys who are even safer that I would rather be on as well. So let's get into those guys, who I like at starting pitching. For me, the top starting pitcher on the day is going to be Zach Greinke. He's a -165 favorite, goes up against Milwaukee, so it's a little bit of a revenge game for him. Now, right now, Milwaukee has the 4th worst batting average in the league. They have the 4th lowest number of runs scored so far this season, and they're 5th overall in strikeouts. So when you're looking at a starting pitcher and what you want from him, you want a guy who's a big favorite and has a good chance for a win. So Greinke at -165 definitely fits that bill. You want a guy, especially if you're paying up, because Greinke is the second or third most expensive pitcher tonight on all sites. If you're paying up, you want him to have strikeout potential. If he has strikeout potential, then he has the potential to put up a big number for you. And Greinke definitely has both strikeout potential, and the team that he's playing has strikeout potential as well. So those two things should fit together to give him a high strikeout game, which, again, is exactly what we want for daily fantasy, because that's the best way that we can bump up his score. And then, obviously, you want to limit the negative events. So if you're pitching against a team like Greinke is that has the fourth worst batting average in the league and the fourth lowest number of runs scored, those are two things in his favor that, it's a good chance he won't be giving up a lot of hits today, and there's a good chance that the hits that he does give up won't be translating into a lot of runs. Now, the one caveat I want to throw out here is a lot of those numbers were without Carlos Gomez, who is arguably either their best or their second best hitter in that lineup. Gomez is back right now, so he does extend that lineup a little bit, give him some more length, and give him a guy who can hit at top of that lineup that, basically can hit for power, can hit for average, can steal a base. He has a very unique skill set where he's basically able to do a little bit of everything for that team. So he is back right now, which makes that lineup a little bit stronger. But again, the thing that Greinke struggles the most with is left-handed bats. And if you look at that Milwaukee Brewers team, there's really only three left-handed bats on that entire team that get a decent amount of at-bats. And that's Adam Lind, who's not a bad player, but is not anybody who's great. He will probably be the guy who gives Greinke the most trouble today. And then you can look at guys like, Scooter Gennett or maybe like a Gerardo Parra. Those are guys who are also left-handed sticks, not horrible left-handed sticks. But again, Greinke's a very good pitcher. I don't think it's going to be something that he struggles with. He's got a 1.93 ERA throughout the first part of the season. His WHIP is at .92. So I'm expecting him to go 6 or 7 innings, wind up with about 6 or 7 strikeouts, maybe limit the damage to only 1 or 2 runs, and keep them to less than a hit per inning. So on all sites today, the top guy who I'm going to be recommending is Zack Greinke. Now, I could already hear everybody in the background talking about Steven Strasburg. So let me give you the case against Strasburg today so you understand why I'm so high on Greinke. Basically, that's the choice that you're going to have to make. If you're going to spend up for a pitcher, it basically comes down to spending up for either Greinke or Strasburg today. Now, don't get me wrong, Strasburg doesn't have the worst matchup either. He goes up against a Miami Marlins team that is 6th in the league in strikeouts. And as we all know, one of the big assets that Strasburg has is that he's a big strikeout pitcher. So there is a little bit of a upside for him today, as he could wind up with a big strikeout game. Now, with that being said, as we mentioned earlier, there are some weather concerns there. So that's something that's going to be keeping me off him at the beginning. And unlike Greinke, who goes up against a team that's 5th in the league in strikeouts, he's going up against a team that's 6th in the league in strikeouts. But the big difference to me is Miami is in the top 10 for both batting average and runs scored so far this year. Whereas if you look at Milwaukee, the matchup that Greinke has, they're in the bottom 5. Actually, they're 4th worst in both of those categories. So you're basically talking about two teams that do strike out a lot, but one guy is going up against a team that strikes out and also hits the ball pretty well. The other guy is going up against a team that strikes out and doesn't hit the ball pretty well. And the guy who's going up against a team that doesn't hit the ball pretty well is actually cheaper than the guy who's going up against a team that does hit the ball well. Now, again, Greinke's in a little bit of a better hitter's park, but it's not a park that he hasn't pitched in before. He pitched for Milwaukee. He's been in Milwaukee before. It's not something that's going to be new to him. And if you look down at Strasburg, one of the problems that Strasburg has had lately is he's been giving up a lot of runs, mostly because he's been giving up a decent amount of long balls. Now, there are a couple guys on that Marlins team that can take him yard. One in particular, Giancarlo Stanton. Basically, when you have a guy throwing as hard as Strasburg, if Stanton makes contact, that ball's going to go pretty far. He's going to give it a ride. So there's a good chance that he might wind up with a home run today. And even if it's not him, the way Strasburg pitches and, as hard as he throws, he has been known to get hit for some home runs every now and then. Now, I don't expect him to give up 10 runs. I still think he'll pitch pretty well. But at the same point in time, if you have a guy who's going to, basically give up a couple hits and maybe a couple runs and is more expensive, you're probably going to want to go to the cheaper guy who you think has a better matchup. And for me, that's Zack Greinke today. I also think that there's some added bonus to using Greinke because Strasburg has the name that draws a lot of people to him. So if you're playing against some people who aren't, big daily fantasy players that play all the time, they're not going to realize it. Strasburg's ceiling has been in the mid to low 20s basically so far this season. He hasn't really put together one of those stud games that makes you think you got to use him. Greinke has done that with some numbers in the high 20s or in the low 30s already. So, like I said, I'm taking a discount on Greinke in that Greinke versus Strasburg matchup. That's the way I'm going to be leaning. But there are some other pitchers that I think you guys should have your eye on. As I said before, I'm going to mention Andrew Cashner, because Cashner's another guy that I think is in a good spot. He's got 36 strikeouts so far in the first 31 innings of the season. His ERA and his WHIP are pretty decent. He's got an ERA that's a little below 3. He's got a WHIP of about 1.25 on the year. He goes up against a San Francisco team that is third last in the league in runs scored so far. The one drawback for them is that San Francisco doesn't strike out a ton. So it's not a game where I'm expecting Cashner to wind up with 10 or 15 strikeouts. But he is still in a very good matchup against kind of a weak lineup that hasn't been scoring a lot of runs. And they're playing in a pitcher's park over in San Francisco. So there's a lot of things that are going Cashner's way as well. And he's definitely a guy that I think, is going to be somebody who you can use. I think he's even good enough today that you could probably roll him out on a one-pitcher site if you wanted to save some money and get some bigger bats. But on a two-pitcher site, I definitely think he is somebody that you could pair with Greinke and have a really strong pitcher pairing for your cash games. In your GPPs, you're probably going to need to go a little bit cheaper to get some more upside, but I wouldn't even mind if you decided to fade Greinke and Strasburg and just go with Cashner in the GPP. There are two guys that I think you can link them with, and it all depends on how you're looking at that game. I really like Rick Porcello and Drew Smyly today in that Tampa Bay versus Boston game. If you remember what we said earlier in the show, Hanley Ramirez got hurt yesterday, went into the wall, threw out his shoulder, and is likely going to be headed for a DL stint. But even if he isn't, he's almost definitely going to be out today, which is going to be a big hole in the middle of that Red Sox lineup. Now, they do have some guys who they can shuffle around. They'll probably wind up with, like, Napoli hitting cleanup today for them, something along those lines. But, again, it weakens the entire lineup overall when you have to put, you take out a bat like Hanley and you have to put in somebody, like a Victorino or maybe a Brock Holt as that other outfielder for you. So I definitely think that Smyly, who's a guy who basically had 10 strikeouts in his last start, this is going to be making his third start on the year. He's a left-hander. He throws pretty hard. He does have some strikeout upside, and he did have a nice run last year for Detroit. He was up and down a little bit, seemed to have tired out towards the end of the season, but right now he seems to be pitching pretty well. Has a matchup in a good pitcher's park, so he's definitely somebody with some upside. And even on the other side of that game, if you think the Red Sox are still going to win, I don't think Rick Porcello is in a bad spot either. He's only 6,600 on DraftKings, so he's very, very cheap. The Tampa Bay team that he goes up against is one of the worst in the league. They're 9th worst in runs, 7th worst in batting average, and I think they're either 7th or they're 3rd, actually. They're 3rd in strikeouts overall. So there's definitely some upside for Porcello today, especially at that price. If he gives you 6 innings, maybe a hit per inning, 1 or 2 walks, and he winds up with 3 or 4 or 5 strikeouts, which is basically what he's been averaging so far this year, there's a good chance that Porcello could return you 20 DraftKings points or more, which would be great value for a guy at 6,600, especially as your SP2 in your tournament rosters today. So those are some of the ideas of guys I think you can look at pitcher. I definitely think that you want to be looking towards Greinke. Cashner is the guy I think should be in a lot of lineups. For cash games, those would be the 2 guys I roll with. In a GPP, if you want to try to make some more money for yourself in these tournaments, I definitely think that Porcello is a guy you could add in there. Or Smyly if you prefer. Smyly has the better K upside with his skills. Porcello has the better K upside based on matchups. So there's definitely some merit to using either of those guys as your cheap option today, and rolling them with either a Greinke or a Cashner. But as you can tell here, I'm going to be fading Strasburg today, so I would suggest you guys do the same. But again, he's a guy who's always highly owned, and I feel always a little overhyped, so I'm going to be staying away from him today. But that basically gives you the rundown of how we feel about the pitching on the day. Pitching is very important, so you got to make sure you nail that. But if you really want to take some money home, you also got to have some good bats in the lineup. So let's take a look at some of the hitters, and then after that, we're going to get into some of our user questions. And Josh is going to come in. He's going to do his segment today, giving you some guys that you really need to look out for, both to the upside and to the downside. And then, as always, we'll give you the cornerstones of our roster. So just give me a minute here. Okay. We're going to move on to hitters. We're going to start with the catchers. There's a couple catchers who I think are in play today. There's basically 4 guys that you're going to be choosing from. It's Brian McCann, Stephen Vogt, A.J. Pierzynski, and Evan Gattis. They're the 4 guys that pop off the page to me. McCann is probably the guy I think is in the best matchup on the day today. He's playing up in Toronto. He hits in the middle of that Yankee order, most likely either 4th or 5th, and he's a left-handed bat going up against Marco Estrada. Now, for those of you who don't remember Marco Estrada has a problem with giving up home runs. Last year, he gave up 29 home runs in about 150 innings. The year before that, he gave up 19 home runs. And the thing about Estrada is he's an equal opportunity home run guy. He gave up 14 last year to left-handed bats, 15 to right-handed bats. The year before, he gave up 10 to left-handed bats, 9 to right-handed bats. So basically, over the course of the last 2.5 seasons, he's given up 24 home runs to each side of the plate. So it really doesn't matter if you're taking righties or lefties against him. I think most of this Yankee lineup is going to be in play, but you want to look for the guys that have some power, because the one thing that Estrada really struggles with is keeping balls up in the zone and having people hit him hard and winding up with home runs. Now, considering that this game is in Toronto's Rogers Center, which is also one of the best parks in the major for hitting home runs, it seems like all the pieces will fit together today. So that's why I have McCann rated right now as my #1 catcher on the day, although I must be honest, his price has come up in places. He has been hot lately. He's been getting a couple hits in his last few games, started knocking a couple home runs out of the park, and he is pretty expensive. I think he's $4,100 on DK. Puts him up in the top 3 for catchers, I think, on the day. So you got to be a little weary of it when he's that expensive, but again, the matchup is really, really good for him today. The next guy I want to talk about is Stephen Vogt. I mean, as I mentioned before, he had 2 home runs on Sunday, had another one yesterday, hits in the middle of that Oakland order. That Oakland order is expected to score some runs. He's a left-handed batter going up against Trevor May, the young righty from the Twins. May struggles with left-handed bats, and as I said, I mean, Vogt's been one of the hottest hitters in the league right now. So he has the home run upside as he's flashed the last couple days. He can get you multiple hits. He's hitting in a good spot in the order to drive in some runs, so he's definitely somebody that I think you got to keep into consideration. Basically with all these guys I'm mentioning, you want to look what site you're playing on and see where you can get the best deal on him. If a guy that we mentioned is cheaper on one site than another, well, then play him on that site. If you want to get exposure to a different catcher, we'll play him in the site that he's the best on. I play on 2 or 3 different sites, on DraftKings, on FanDuel, on Fantasy Aces. Those are the 3 that I'm mostly in. And my lineups can look different every day because you're basically looking for value in daily fantasy. So while you may like, the matchup that one guy has, if somebody else has a similar matchup and the price difference is that much better, that could be the reason all by itself for you to use one player over another. So just keep that in mind when you're building your rosters, especially if you play across multiple sites. The other 2 guys I wanted to mention are A.J. Pierzynski and Evan Gattis. Gattis is one of the guys going up against Wandy Rodriguez. Wandy is the left-handed pitcher for Texas who gives up a lot of home runs. So Gattis is going to be one of those guys who can, basically have a chance to go yard against him. Bats cleanup for Houston, or he has been batting cleanup for Houston lately. So he's definitely in a good lineup spot, and he definitely has a lot of upside today. So the thing with Gattis is he also is a guy who could go 0 for 4 with you, as he does a lot of times with 3 or 4 strikeouts. So if you're playing on a site like DraftKings where all you're worried about is the upside and you don't have to worry about the negatives, I definitely think Gattis is more in play over there than he would be on a site like Fantasy Aces or FanDuel, where those 3 or 4 strikeouts that he can and does have on certain occasions could be something that could really hurt your lineup. So like I said, if you're going to use Gattis, try to use him over on DraftKings, although his price is better in some of the other spots. And then the last guy is A.J. Pierzynski. Pierzynski's going up against Chad Billingsley today. As I said, he was a guy who was a decent pitcher a couple years ago, but has basically been out of the league for about 1.5 years right now. And Pierzynski's a left-handed bat. Billingsley's a right-handed pitcher. So he struggles a little bit with those left-handed bats, and as long as Pierzynski's still batting in the meat of that order, he's definitely somebody you got to consider. His price is still cheap all over the place. I don't expect him to keep up this torrid, hitting 350 pace that he has right now, but he's definitely somebody who you got to consider, especially if you're looking to save some money, because in the middle of that order, you're not going to find many catchers that bat in the middle of the order, and he has both the upside that you need to win a tournament, and basically the way he's been playing, he has the safety that you could even use him in cash games. At a price of like $2,700 on FanDuel and $3,300 or $3,400 on DraftKings, he doesn't need to do much to pay it off for you. So he's a guy that's, as long as they keep his price cheap, is definitely always going to be in play. When his price starts creeping up by the other names that we mentioned, then I would tell you that you got to back off. But for now, if you want to use Pierzynski, you're going to get no arguments from using him from me. So that's basically how I feel about catcher on the day. Moving on to first base, the first guy I'm going to mention, I'm not going to go over the whole argument again, but Mark Teixeira against Marco Estrada, big home run guy, big guy for giving up home runs for the pitcher. great park for hitting home runs. I definitely think that there's going to be a lot of merit in using Tex today. He is basically not an average guy anymore. When he first came over to the Yankees, he was hitting like 320, 325, when he was down in all the other spots that he had along the way as they traded him away from Texas. But since he's come over to Yankee Stadium, he's basically only flashed the power that we've seen from him. He's batting just above 210 right now, but he does have tremendous power, and in a matchup like this where he's in a good spot to hit a home run, I definitely wouldn't mind rolling Teixeira out there. If you're looking for a cheaper option at first base, one of the guys who I do also like is Matt Adams. Now, Adams doesn't have the greatest matchup on the day today, but he is a power bat. He does bat cleanup for that Cardinals team, and his price seems to have been dropped down. On DraftKings, he's down at about $3,700 right now, and he actually came up a little bit on FanDuel, but when I say he came up, he was dirt cheap on FanDuel this week. He was like $2,500 to put him in your lineup at first base. I think he's up to about $3,000 now, but he's definitely another guy who I think still has, some home run upside, although he's not playing in a great hitter's park. And he also has a good splits matchup and a chance to get a couple hits today. And hitting in the middle of that Cardinals order, he also has a chance to drive in a couple runs. So if you're looking to save, I think you can come down to Matt Adams. But my favorite play today at first base and the guy who I think is most likely to hit a home run is definitely going to be Mark Teixeira. Moving on to second base, I know a lot of you probably already know who I'm going to say here, but Jose Altuve is getting a left-handed pitcher. That left-handed pitcher is Wandy Rodriguez, who's not very good. And, there's basically nothing more you need to say about this matchup right now. Anytime Altuve gets a left-handed pitcher, you got to have him in your lineup or you got to think about putting him in your lineup. I know a couple people are going to be off him because of his price, but let me just tell you what he's done in his last couple games. 9 out of his last 10 games, he has hit double-digit DraftKings points. Now, that's an insane stat. If you're looking for a guy who can be consistent for you in your cash games, you can't get any better than 9 out of the last 10 games having a guy with double-digit points. Now, I understand he's $5,300. He's not cheap. He's not easy to fit into a lineup, and you're going to have to make some sacrifices in order to get him. But as we've said, you want to get to about 120 points in these tournaments, in these 50-50s, in order for you to be pretty much within the cash line that you need. So that means that you're going to need about 40 points out of your pitching and about 80 points out of your hitters. You get 8 hitters, so you need at least 10 points out of them. If you can tell me that there's a guy who 90% of the time is going to get me at least the 10 points that I need in order to be in a good spot, then I definitely think he's worth the price that they're asking him to pay. Now, again, that price is going up. He's $5,300 today on DraftKings. He's almost $5,000 on FanDuel, which for a second baseman is basically unheard of. But again, as long as he keeps producing the way he's producing, you really can't argue with what you're getting out of him when you use him. So Jose Altuve is definitely a guy, if you can afford to fit him in your lineup, you fit him in your lineup today. If you can't afford to fit him in your lineup, then move somebody else and find some money and make sure you put him in there because it's too good of a matchup and he's too good of a player against left-handed pitching for you not to consider him as one of the guys you should be using at second base. If you want to do a little bit of a cheaper option, I also think Neil Walker's in a pretty good spot today. He hits better from the left side of the plate when he's going up against right-handed pitching, and that's the matchup that he gets today against the young rookie in Cincinnati. I don't think that there's a ton of upside to him because he hasn't really been hitting it all that well lately, but he's definitely somebody that you might want to consider if you're looking to save money. But as I said, Altuve is just in too good of a spot and too good of a matchup for you not to think about Altuve as one of the top guys that you should be playing today. Moving on to third base. Third base and shortstop I'm going to talk about together because I'm using the best left side of the infield in baseball today. I'm hoping that the rain holds off in that game, and if it does, I think that you basically have to use Nolan Arenado and Troy Tulowitzki. They're back in Coors Field. They're right-handed batters. They're going up against a weak left-handed pitcher and Robbie Ray, who's been a guy who came up last year with Detroit, had a couple starts over there with them, bounced around the league a little bit. He only pitches about 5 or 6 innings a game, but he really struggles against right-handed bats. And if you're going to put guys like Arenado and Troy Tulowitzki in the middle of that Rockies lineup, you're going to put them at Coors Field, I definitely think there's an absolute ton of upside for using both of those guys. So as we know, both of them mash left-handed pitching. This is basically a tailor-made matchup for you. Now, they're expensive, and you're going to have to pay up for them. And as I said, you got to keep your eye on the weather to make sure that the weather is in line. But if that game's going off, especially with the other big bat at shortstop being Hanley Ramirez not being able to play, I think Tulowitzki is an automatic must-start at shortstop today for you. And I definitely think that Nolan Arenado is not a bad guy to pair with him. Now, if you did need another third baseman and you wanted to save some money, again, I'm going to go back to that same Marco Estrada well up in Toronto, and I'm going to recommend Alex Rodriguez. Now, whether you love this guy or whether you hate this guy, it really doesn't matter to me. What matters is he's been hitting pretty well, and he's definitely been hitting for some power right now. You know, he's looking to break some records, some home run records this year, and he gets a pitcher who's a home run pitcher. He gets to play up in a home run park. And as I said, Estrada is a right-hander, which is not the preferred split that you would like to see, but he's an equal opportunity home run allower. He gave up 24 to righties and 24 to lefties over the course of the last 2 years. So it doesn't really make a difference what side of the plate you put somebody on. You know, he's gonna be a guy that can, you know, give up the home runs to him. If you need another third base option, I also like Todd Frazier a little bit. I think he's a guy you might want to consider. He's going up against the lefty lock, and he's not in a great hitter's park, so he's definitely well below the other two. But you know, just somebody to keep on your radar. Moving on, I gave you guys a lot of expensive infielders, so there's 3 outfielders that I wanted to mention real quick here, and all 3 of them are guys I'm going to be using. You know, not to continue to beat that dead horse, but Brett Gardner is somebody else who's on my radar for the Yankees today. You know, playing in that high over-under game up in Toronto, it's definitely a good situation for him. And again, he's in a hitter's park against a guy who struggles against left-handed batters, and he's been red hot lately. He's put up some big numbers, so Gardy is definitely somebody I think you might want to keep an eye on. Another guy who's been red hot and putting up big numbers is Gregory Polanco from Pittsburgh, and he gets a good matchup today against Cincinnati. Basically, he has 90 fantasy points over his last 8 starts. So he's a guy who's at $4,000 on DraftKings that's averaging over 11 points a start, which is, if you look at the guys that are averaging anywhere near 10, 11 points a start, they're all basically $1,000 more expensive than he is. So he's been hitting on top of that Pirates order, and I definitely think he's another guy that you might want to take a look at today. And then, assuming that Colorado and Arizona game does go off, the only left-handed bat, excuse me, the one left-handed bat that I really want to be on in Arizona is David Peralta. When he goes up against right-handed pitching, he's usually batting in the 5th hole, and he's definitely been producing lately for that Diamondback team. So with all the runs we know come from Coors Field, those are definitely some of the guys who I'm going to be looking at today. Before we get on to some of the user questions today, I'm going to bring in Josh Kalachi. He's got a couple guys that he wants to let you guys know about. 2 guys in particular that he thinks you definitely should be using, and 1 guy who he thinks you should avoid, both in the pitching and hitting realm. So, Josh, you want to take it away and let the people know what you're looking at today?
I agree with you. My first pitcher today is all about Zach Greinke. He's the guy I think you have to target, right? As you can see on the screen, his price on DraftKings is at a glance. You can look at splits, game logs. One of the cool things you can look at using these daily fantasy sites, and that's exactly why I'm targeting Greinke. You can see all those numbers there. In addition, one of the reasons why I like Greinke today is because he's a good, what we call a pivot, a good reason to go away from a guy like Steven Strasburg, because he's a little bit cheaper, but as Benny said, he has a good matchup against the Brewers. The Brewers are hitting just .237 against right-handed pitching this year and have struck out 23% of their at-bats, which is in the top 5 in pretty much all of baseball. Given the fact that Greinke is a talented pitcher, this matchup becomes even juicier. A lot of the matchups against the Brewers will start guys that are mid-tier pitchers, maybe even low-tier pitchers. But considering Greinke's a top-tier pitcher, I'm definitely going to be all over him for all of my lineups on FanDuel and on DraftKings. He has an ERA of under 2, a WHIP, which is walks and hits per inning pitch, under 1. He's not giving up base runners. He has a strikeout upside, and he's 4-0. The Dodgers lineup scoring some runs for him, and he can get you that win bonus, which is huge. My other pitcher today is a guy that Benny doesn't like much, but I'm still targeting, and that's Shelby Miller, and here's why. We always detail the Phillies' offense is not one of the better offenses in baseball. Of course it's not, but they don't strike out a lot. That's something that Benny detailed earlier. Here's why I still like Shelby Miller, though. Miller has thrown a lot more cutters and two-seamers this season, something that he has not had in the past. Those of you that played baseball and watch baseball, a two-seamer goes away from lefties and a cutter comes in righties. So there's just different way, or comes in on lefties. So those are just 2 different ways that they can use to avoid the barrel of the bat against left-handed pitching or left-handed hitters. The Phillies have left-handed hitters. They will probably have 8 of 9 guys today being a lefty, including or just the only guy probably being Carlos Ruiz, who's right-handed. Now, Miller's been able to get lefties out a lot more this season because of those 2 new pitchers, and that's something why I like to target him. Now, he does not have that strikeout upside, as Benny did detail, but the fact remains that he can get 7 or 8 innings and potentially get a win. So if he can get 4 or 5 strikeouts, still looking at 20 fantasy points on DraftKings, you're looking at anywhere between 12 and 15 on FanDuel, and that's the reason why I'm targeting him. He's a little bit more expensive than he has been. Pairing him with Greinke gives you the best shot to have 2 pitchers that could get a win, pitch deeper into ball games, and potentially put up a few strikeouts to make your way towards cash. I have one pitcher to stay away from, and I don't know if Benny's going to agree with me or not here, but I'm staying away from Danny Salazar against the Royals. Salazar has been incredible to this point. There's no denying that. He struck out, I believe, something like 26 years so far in 3 starts. But with all the other available options today, I'm staying away from him, especially because he's facing the Royals. The Royals lead baseball in batting average and are the hardest to strike out against right-handed pitchers. That's 2 big no-nos in your check boxes of research, and that's 2 main reasons why I'm staying away from Salazar. In addition, he faced the Royals last week. I believe it was last Sunday, about 9 or 10 days ago. So all those hitters are going to see him again, and that's not something you want to see as a pitcher. You want to see different hitters. You want to see guys that haven't seen you before, and that's one reason why I'm staying away from him today. Moving into 2 hitters, I have 2 cheaper guys that you're going to have to use because guys like Tulowitzki, guys like Jose Altuve, you're going to have to get some cheap guys to get those 2 in your lineup. So I'll go with Marwin Gonzalez today against Wandy Rodriguez. With the rest of the Astros lineup being expensive, as Benny talked about, guys like Springer, Evan Gattis, some of those guys are going to be highly owned, but the other guys you're not going to be finding very much, and that's I think he's 3,000 on DraftKings, he's probably under that on FanDuel. He usually hits 6, especially with the new Houston lineup. If he's able to get up in that second spot, I'm targeting him in 50-50s and head-to-heads as well as tournaments. Now, the reason why I like him is obviously we talked about Wandy Rodriguez not being a very good left-handed pitcher. But Marwin Gonzalez has a little bit of pop. He can hit the ball out of the ballpark. You've seen it, I believe, twice so far this year. So if you get him into your lineup at just 3,000 or below that on FanDuel, he has the upside to hit the ball out of the ballpark against a pretty poor left-handed pitcher. Another cheap option I'm going with in the outfield, Billy Burns. You can't say enough about this guy right now because his price is just far too low, especially considering the fact that he's going to be leading off for the Oakland Athletics. He faces Trevor May today, who has not been great, but he's a decent pitcher in terms of pitching to contact. But that's exactly why we like Billy Burns, because he's fast enough to get on base in the if he hits a ground ball to the infield. If he's deep shortstop or third baseman's going to range and make a play, Burns is going to beat it out, and that's another reason why I like him is because of his speed. He has that upside field base 2, which on DraftKings, as we've detailed before with Benny and Rath, that's a 5-point bonus. That's huge. 2 stolen bases is nearly just as good as a triple, which is a big thing on DraftKings to get those points. Now, FanDuel stolen bases aren't worth as much, but it's still just another way the guy can score. I'm going to have to get these cheaper guys like Marwin Gonzalez, like Billy Burns, who I think is probably the top value play today because of his price and leading off in a good lineup against a poor pitcher. One hitter that I do have to stay away from today, a lot of guys have been targeting him lately, especially with Carlos Gomez back in that Brewers lineup, but I'm staying away from Ryan Braun today against Greinke. A lot of guys will look at him as a potential contrarian because Greinke is one of the better pitchers in baseball and Braun hit the ball, but his price is far too high. Even if you're looking to go contrarian against the grain with a 3-hitter like Braun, guy that can drive and runs, his price is just too high for me on both sites because the other guys you can get at his price have far better matchups, and some of them are just better players. So, Benny, those are my guys that I'm staying away from and the guys I'm looking forward to. Did you want to get into some user questions now?
Yeah, there's one in particular that I really wanted to make sure that we addressed today because I was glad that, Doug felt comfortable enough to ask this question to us because it's something that I have seen other people thinking about it and kicking around. And it kind of illustrates a point that, I was making with another user who I'll get into in a second. But Doug Boyle on our forum, one of our users, left a question. Basically, here's what he said. I've had a rough time with pitchers getting negatives lately. Guys like Chris Sale, Carlos Martinez, Taijuan Walker, Joe Kelly. And it's gotten to the point where I'm honestly considering starting a relief pitcher instead because with the negatives that these guys got me, I would be better off and I would have won more this week. What are your thoughts on doing this over on DraftKings? So basically, here's the way I'm going to break it down to you. I understand your pain, Doug, because as you know, I too was on Chris Sale that day, and I too was looking at Carlos Martinez as one of my options yesterday. So I have had those same problems with the negatives. And those negatives are killer because when you get one of those, you could have had a great lineup around them, and you got a guy who's basically giving you, in the case of those guys, I mean, I think it was like -8, -10 points, and that's huge. And the reason why that's huge is because pitching is so important. And this kind of answers both parts of the question that you had so far, and I wanted to put them together to show you how the two of them work together. Basically, when you're looking at your lineup, as we said, you want to get to about that 120 mark. Well, with that 120 mark, you want to get about 40 to 50 points out of your pitching. So your pitching is basically worth about 30 to 40% of your overall score. So if you're willing to take a guy like a relief pitcher who, again, now let's think about this. In order for that relief pitcher to get you any positive points, he would have to come in to that game, he would have to pitch well, and he would probably have to pick up a save. Because if all he does is come in and pitch an inning and get a strikeout, maybe give up a hit, he's only going to get you about 3 points. Now, I know that the relief pitchers are kind of cheap on DraftKings, but if the upside that a guy can give you is basically only paying off his salary or maybe giving you 1.5, points per $1,000 of his salary, then that's not really upside at all for you. And I know over the long haul, you may think that, well, if I would have done that the other day, I would have had extra money to spend on bats or to spend here or to spend there. And while you're right, it just doesn't make sense for you to use a relief pitcher when the relief pitcher's ceiling is so low. I mean, probably the best case scenario for you would be using a guy like Aroldis Chapman, have him come in, pitch an inning, strike out all 3 batters, pick up a save, and he's still only going to get you about 10 points. Now, in that situation, it might seem like that's good, but remember now, there's 162 games in a baseball season. The best pitchers in the league, the guys who set the, records for saves, are in the high 40s, low 50s, the high 40s, low 50s kind of numbers. So even if you do use that guy, you still have less than a 1 in 3 chance that he's going to play. And even if he does play, how many times have we seen a relief pitcher come in, give up 2 hits, and then a 3-run home run, and then that's the end of the game, or, he pitches the rest of that inning or something like that, but he could give up a home run and give up 3 or 4 runs and wind up with a negative number just as easy as a starter could. And to be honest, it's probably even easier because if he comes in and the first guy he pitches to in a tie game, hits a home run and goes yard, well, he's going to have 0 innings pitched, so you get nothing for that. He's going to have 0 strikeouts, so you get nothing for that. And it's just going to be a negative number for the hit that he gave up and the run that he gave up. So it's definitely not something that makes sense to you for using a relief pitcher. I would definitely never recommend it, and I definitely don't think that it's something you should ever do. It makes no sense in cash games, and it makes even less sense in GPPs. And here's another way to look at it. If it was a viable strategy that could work out for you, you would have some of the big players in the industry doing it more often. And when I say more often, I mean more than never, because right now nobody ever does that. So why I understand where you're coming from and I can feel your pain, you definitely don't want to start a relief pitcher. So that's the easy answer to the question. The second part of the question, though, is what's more important to me, and that's with your starting pitching, you haven't been doing well lately. So what you're really asking me is, how can I make sure that I stay away from some of these guys with negatives? And what I'm going to tell you is what I tell everybody all the time is you have to believe and trust in the process that you're using. I got a tweet right before I came on the air today from a user who follows us along named Gary, and he basically said to me, thanks for telling me to stick with my process, because last night he put up a 62 on FanDuel and, wound up taking some money home and having a really good night. And he basically had the same kind of question that you had been asking me on Twitter last week. He had a couple guys that he took as pitchers that, basically got blown up in the first and second inning. But it doesn't matter that the guy that you took got blown up as long as your process is right. It's going to happen. We say all the time, there's days when a guy who had a horrible matchup goes 4 for 4 with 2 home runs, and other days where a guy goes 0 for 4. The same thing works for pitching. A guy could be in a great matchup and give up 6 or 7 runs, whereas a guy who's in a horrible matchup could wind up being a guy who throws a shutout on a day. Things like that happen in baseball, but the idea is to put yourself in the best spot day after day. And that's why I said you got to trust in the process that you have. When you came up with Chris Sale on that day, if you go back and look at the other tournaments that were being played, Sale is 60-70% owned in 50-50s. So it wasn't like your process brought you to a guy that nobody else in the world was looking at. Everybody was looking at Chris Sale that day. Everybody was on him, and everybody was hurt by him blowing up. If you're in a 50-50 and a guy like that blows up, you still have, like I said, there's only 30% of the people that didn't use him. So there's still 20% of the people in that tournament that are going to cash at a minimum with Chris Sale on their roster. If you were playing in cash games that day, and you go back and look at all your cash games, there's a lot of people who also had Chris Sale in those same cash games. So if you have Sale and they have Sale, because he's the guy that most people came to by going through the process, it's basically going to balance itself out for you. Now instead of playing 9-on-9, you're playing 8-on-8 to see who has the best roster on the day. So even if those are the guys that you came to by way of the process, what you want to be more worried about is my process putting me on the right guys? Even the Carlos Martinez one. Martinez was a guy who was 30, 40% owned in some spots. Even in GPPs, he was 20, 30% owned in these large tournaments. So if that's what you're getting out of it, and that's the guy who you came to, you're not alone in coming to those guys. Like I said, every once in a while, everybody's going to be wrong. Everybody's going to see the same things. Everybody's looking at the same stats. Everybody's getting pointed in the same direction. Doesn't mean that you're always going to be right or you're always going to be wrong, but if you do have, the process that is putting you on the same guys that as everybody else is on, when they blow up, you can't feel as bad about it because you were not the only one who was out on a limb on that guy. Even Joe Kelly that you mentioned who got blown up, there was limited options on that slate, and Kelly was one of the guys that people were talking about and that people were on. So when you have a bad situation like that, you just don't worry about it. You move on to the next day, and that's why we talk about bankroll management. That's why you don't go all in on any given day, because on any given day, anything can happen in baseball. Josh, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, the other thing I was going to say is exactly touching up what you were talking about with the process is when you look back at results, like Chris Sale having negative numbers, opening day, Matt Latos having negative numbers, that's all based on process-oriented results, and that's exactly what we're targeting here, because more often than that, the correct process is going to yield good results. Looking back on results-oriented research, that tells you you're looking at a guy that because he had 13 points yesterday, that means he's going to have 13 points today, and that's the opposite of what we're targeting here. We want to look at the way to target the correct research, the way to find guys that have good matchups in good situations, and being able to find a reliever, to answer your question, they have much more variance. It's kind of like a hitter, a low-price hitter, which you just never know when they're going to be up or down. But if you're targeting big starters, you get 34 starts a year, and chances are guys like Chris Sale are going to blow up once or twice. So those other 33 times, you're going to have a good day, and that's exactly why we like to trust the process and go after those top guys rather than taking a chance on Dylan Bettis or a guy like Aroldis Chapman that's Benny just detailed.
Yeah, you basically can't make up those. I know you like the fact that you'd be able to save a couple bucks by using a reliever over a starter, but the money that you're saving there to get better bats is not something that you're going to be able to make up those points with on a consistent basis. So, as I said, I know it might not seem right, but you really do want to put two starters in there. Stay away from using the relief pitchers, and again, trust in your process. I mean, I had a bad week last week as well because I was on a lot of the same pitchers you did. But you know what? Last night was pretty good, and I'm looking forward to tonight being another one. And it does go in spurts. You'll have a couple days in a row where you have bad rosters. Then you have a couple days in a row where it feels like anything you enter, you're going to wind up winning or taking some cash from. And that's just the way it is. But speaking of winning and taking some cash, Josh, it's that time in the show where we give people an idea of the cornerstones we're going to be using to win and take some cash home tonight. So do you want to start the people off and let them know who you're using to build your rosters today?
All my lineups today, first guy going in, Zach Greinke. We talked about him multiple occasions. I discussed him. Benny discussed him. He's that top matchup, and he's that top pitcher for me. So I'm going to have on two pitcher sites, probably going to pair him with Shelby Miller because I like the safety against the Phillies and the ability that he has with those two new pitchers to get lefties out. I'm going to need some money to play with to get some top hitters like Jose Altuve. So I'm going to have to put in guys like Billy Burns and Erwin Gonzalez because those two guys on both sides, and on Fantasy Aces and other sites as well, are going to be cheap, which allows you to get those top bats like an Altuve or like a Tulowitzki, as Benny talked about. But some other tournament options I'm looking at, I like the Cubs right-hand bats against Tyler Leones. I know some other guys talking about different kinds of stacks, maybe the Astros or something like that. But in my tournament games, I'm going to target a lot of those Cubs righties. Maybe today's the day that Chris Bryant gets his first home run. What are you doing with your lineups, Benny?
Well, I'm going to 100% completely agree with you on Greinke being the way I start with. I think Greinke is the guy. If you're playing on a one-pitcher site, Greinke's that one pitcher for me tonight. If I'm on a two-pitcher site, Greinke is one of those two pitchers for me tonight. When I'm playing in my cash games, I really like Andrew Cashner, so he's going to be the guy who I pair up with Greinke a lot. Definitely on Fantasy Aces and very likely on DraftKings as well. He's the guy I have in those rosters right now. I think the two of them provide you a very safe floor. They both have upside for you, and it's going to be an easy 40 to 50 points out of your pitching if you have those two guys together. In order to do that, I'm going to need to take a few cheap bets as well. Guys like Ryan Rayburn are in good spots, Melky Cabrera. I agree with that call on the right-handed Cubs bats. A guy like Jorge Soler is somebody who I like. I also, as I mentioned before, really like guys like Peralta, Gregory Polanco. As you notice, most of these guys are outfielders because the infielders I'm going to use are the guys I mentioned before. Guys like Tulowitzki, guys like Arenado, guys like A-Rod, guys like Altuve, guys like Teixeira, Matt Adams at catcher, Brian McCann, Vogt. I'm probably going to be staying away from Gaddis. I don't love Gaddis or George Springer as much as a lot of other people do. I think their strikeouts are a little too high. But again, against Wandy Rodriguez, they both have the chance to go yard, which is basically what they're going to need to do in order to pay off their salary, and they both have a good chance to do that. So I'm not going to knock anybody who uses some of those Houston bats, but the only Houston bat I'm going to be on is a guy like Altuve, who I said is expensive, so I'm going to need some of those cheaper outfielders to make it work. But I'm paying up at pitching. I'm paying up mostly through the middle of my infield today, and I'm going to try to find some value at the corner infield spots and the outfield in order to make it work for me. And that's basically the way I'm going to be going at it today.
That brings us to the end of the hour and another great show for today. We talked about a lot of different stuff. That user question was very helpful for me, especially because it brought back a bit of the basics, because that's one thing we like to talk about. And when all goes right or wrong, it's all about the basics, and that's how we win in daily fantasy baseball and daily fantasy sports as a whole. That brings us to the end of the show. We will see you tomorrow, Wednesday at May 6th at noon Eastern Time. Be sure to check out RotoCurve on Twitter, RotoCurve. Follow Benny at BennyR11 and myself at Josh Kalachi. Be sure to check out the forums on RotoCurve's site and the chat. Every day we'll be there for a few hours at a time, just taking your questions. And the forums you can go on anytime. Somebody will get to you as soon as possible. And remember, with those new curve points, it's a good time to be active. You can get a lot of good stuff in the RotoCurve store, between shirts, hats. I even saw a visor I'm going to have to check out for the golf course. But be sure to get your Roto points soon and take advantage of everything. For Benny Ricciardi, I'm Josh Kalachi. This has been The Curve. Betty, you have one more thing left?
That's right. As always, stay classy, DFS. We love you guys. Have a good day.